I just love it when I get a Facebook feed that says, 200 years ago today, this happened. Or Instagram, 100 years ago, this occurred. So I just happened to look it up. April the 7th. If we were in New York City and it was 1712, we'd be in one of the largest riots in U.S. history. In 1798, just 2 states to the west, Mississippi was finally organized as a territory. And if you want to go to the first camel race in the United States, you have to go to Sacramento, California on this date in 1864. If you enjoy watching television, you'd have to be in New York City. The first long-distance transmission of a television signal occurred in 1927. 3 years later in New York, they began building the Empire State Building today. And here in Georgia on April 7th in 1995, the state finally adopted the peach as its official fruit. That's probably the most important thing in the whole thing. But history is simply a matter of where you are and when you are. And if we could somehow go back a couple of millennia to this date, perhaps, but it was certainly a spring day. It was certainly a day close to Passover in a little town just 2 miles outside of Jerusalem called Bethany. We would find what happens in John chapter 11. So if you would turn over to John chapter 11. We're in our series, Jesus, and we're peering into the life of Jesus. Just before he goes to the cross and to the tomb and resurrects, we're studying who he was and what he did and what he taught us. And for some, John 11 is going to be a familiar story. For others, it might be brand new. But I want us to take a fresh look at John 11. And please just grant the request that for a few moments, even if you know the outcome, pretend you don't. John is narrating this story 60 years after it occurred. So there were probably some people who had heard it before he had committed it to writing. But this is just before Jesus' passion, just before the Passover, that would eventually lead to the garden, the cross, and the tomb. It's just prior to this in John chapter 10 that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Jerusalem had challenged him when he said, "Before Abraham was, I am." And they picked up stones to kill him because he was claiming to be the Messiah. He was even claiming to be equal to God. And now here in chapter 11, Jesus is with his disciples on the east side of the Jordan, avoiding his adversaries, but now he receives a word. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now a man named Lazarus was sick, and he was in Bethany, a village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus was now sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Now the Gospels tell us about Martha and Mary, particularly the Gospel of Luke. And Mary is such a common name. In verse 2, John identifies her as the one who wiped Jesus' feet with her hair. Ironically, we don't read about that till chapter 12. But like I said, they had probably heard the story before, so he's identifying, he's narrating it for us. Jesus hears that the one you love is sick. The family is sending word. They receive this word that he is ill. How would you respond? I mean, I have friends who, if they get sick, they don't call me, but if they get really sick, their family calls and says, "Jim, Tim's in the hospital. Tim is sick." What do? Well, you hop in the car, you at least make a phone call, you check into it, you show some level of concern. But how did Jesus respond? Look at verse 4. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, and so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Now notice, Jesus doesn't say Lazarus is going to die or isn't going to die. He says the story's just not going to end with Lazarus dying. He says whatever's about to happen, it's going to be for a deeper purpose, an intentional event. Jesus has healed the infirmed. He has cast out demons. He has fed thousands. He has publicly performed miracles. But what he is about to do is orchestrate an event for a specific purpose. Yet he sits there for 2 days. He doesn't even begin to move toward Bethany. He just stays put. I mean, for what we think about Jesus, this sounds contradictory, counterintuitive. The one you love is ill. It's Mary and Martha, your friends. It's Lazarus. He's the one who's sick. And the plan is we're just going to sit here. Yes. But wait. Why am I waiting for 2 days? It does seem strange. But you see, he has a plan. We need to realize that when God doesn't seem to be acting fast enough for us, when he doesn't seem to be working on our timetable, when we want our prayers answered now, and God has a greater sense of purpose, something greater in mind, more beneficial to us, more important in mind. As disciples, they had to realize that the short term isn't as important as the long term or the eternal. And we need to learn that his good is for our good. And that means sometimes we have to accept his will even when we don't understand it. So we read on further in verse 7. Then, that's after the 2 days, he said to the disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." So Jesus finally decides, and how are the disciples going to act? Look at verse 8. "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going to go back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight, and a man who walks in the day will not stumble, for he sees by the world's light? It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." Now let's be honest, the disciples are scared. They're traveling with Jesus. They tried to kill him in Judea, and probably them. Yes, our friend in Bethany needs us. Lazarus needs you. But realize what you're planning to do puts us all in danger. Just one chapter prior, they had tried to stone him. And Bethany is only 2 miles away from Jerusalem. He's speaking a little cryptically in verses 9 and 10. Some people think it simply is trying to say it's easier to travel in the day than it is at night. But what Jesus is really saying, it's time to come out. It's time to show people who I am. I'm tired of avoiding my adversaries over here on the east side of the Jordan. It's time for me to let people see who I truly, truly am. Look at verse 11. After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Notice they're still trying to convince him to stay. Let's not go. Jesus had been speaking about his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for what? For your sake. I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." There's optimism. Jesus knows Lazarus is dead. He has fallen asleep. He shares it with them, but they miss the point. "Jesus, don't you get it? If he's sleeping, he'll recover more. You showing up and waking him up doesn't help. Let's just stay here." I remember one time after a car wreck, the doctor had put me on so many muscle relaxants, I was just laying in a waterbed. At least I think it was a waterbed. And my mom came up to help me, and she says, "Oh, I'll move that pillow," and she pulled the pillow out from under my head so that my head struck the board. "Thanks for the help. Let him sleep. Don't bother him. Just let him wake up on his own. Don't go and wake him up." The disciples didn't get it. Look at verse 14 again. He has to tell them plainly, he's dead. And I let this happen. I let this happen for your sake. I didn't go to Lazarus when I could have healed him because I have something bigger in mind, something that's going to stretch your belief. Sometimes we don't understand the Lord's timing, but that's when we're asked to believe even more. Even when He tells us, hey, we've got this, I've got this, trust me, we still question, was this the right course of action? Is this the right time? We've waited 2 days. We can wait more. Maybe the situation will fix itself. After 3 years of doing life together with Jesus, he still has to explain himself. What Jesus is really asking for is trust. You believe, but you have to believe, I've got this. Believe me, not just simply to follow, but to trust me. I myself have had this experience in making my decision to trust God that when He opens doors, He expects you to walk through them. Maybe this is what God is asking some of you to do, to take the next step, to make the big decision, to step out from the certain and the familiar to the uncertain and the unknown, to take Jesus aside and say, I trust you. It's like swimming. How many of you know how to swim? Okay? Remember the deep end of the pool? You didn't dare jump in until you really knew how to swim, but you didn't really know you could do it until you what? Dove in. Jesus is looking at us and saying, I know you believe, but do you trust me? Do you trust me? Heritage, I know you believe. But Jesus is looking at you and say what? Trust me. I've got this. The disciples get up and they follow reluctantly. They cross the Jordan. They begin toward Bethany. And look what it says in verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus is already dead, had already been in the tomb, for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Remember, this is where his adversaries had been before who tried to stone him. And many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Notice, it doesn't say Jesus learned of his death. He simply learned that he had been in the tomb for 4 days. So it's probably about a week since he got news of Lazarus' illness. Martha and Mary, rather than being comforted by Jesus, the person they wanted to be there, are being comforted by mourners. And Martha goes out to meet Jesus. Mary stays behind to be with the mourners, not to leave them alone in the house. So how does Martha greet Jesus? Look at verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Mixed emotions. I mean, wouldn't you have that? Grateful that Jesus has finally gotten there, but that's the whole point. You could have healed my brother. If you'd only been here a few days earlier, didn't you get my message? Why the delay? Why couldn't you have come faster? What kept you? She still believes that Jesus can intervene even now. There's still hope. Look at verse 23. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She doesn't get it. Just like the disciples, she doesn't see what Jesus is fully going to do, what he's capable of doing. He says to her, I'm going to raise Lazarus. And she gives him a theological response. Well, of course, in the last days, Ezekiel's valley of dry bones coming back to life, the latter part of the Old Testament talking about a resurrection on Judgment Day. Of course, he'll be resurrected in the last days, but Jesus isn't talking about later. He's talking about now. He's looking at her saying, I will raise your brother. She stands in the presence of Jesus and still doesn't understand. She doesn't grant him the authority, the power, the position that he deserves. She recognizes Jesus. She believes in Jesus, but she hasn't fully comprehended who he is. So now he reveals himself in verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe? He tells Martha, the resurrection isn't some future event, some unfounded desire, some distant reality. It stands right before you. I am the resurrection and the life. Now, 2 quick notes. When he says, I am, that's actually a claim to him being the Messiah, him being deity. In Exodus chapter 3, when God appeared before Moses, and Moses said, who do I tell sent me? Exodus chapter 3, verse 14 says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. In John 10, this very same phrase caused the Jews to pick up stones because he was blaspheming. He now reminds Martha who she's talking with. I am the resurrection. But then he says, and I'm also the life. And you'd expect it to be bios, where we get the word biology from. He's going to raise Lazarus back to life, but it isn't. It's Zoe. And Zoe means the inner life. He says, I am the resurrection, but I can also resurrect your dead spirit. And that's what he can do. He says, I can reanimate a corpse, but even more, I can give your life, your inner life, your spiritual life, a brand new start. That's what he means for all of us. That the new has come and the old can be put away. We have new life in Jesus Christ, a rebirth. We begin life with his eyes, valuing what he did, living as he wanted to live, prioritizing what he elevated. We become fully alive. Jesus can take our dead spirit, our fallen state, our brokenness, and give us Zoe. That's what he meant in John chapter 10, verse 10. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. More important than raising the dead, I can raise your eternal spirit. And so he turns to Martha and he says, do you believe? Verse 27. Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. It's the Great Confession 2.0. You are the Christ, the Son of God. That's the same question he puts to us. Do you believe that I am the resurrection and the life? You see, what he wants Martha to realize is that you can have hope in me. Martha, you believe. The disciples can trust, but you can hope. And she, by the way, Heritage, you believe, but your hope is placed in Jesus. Your hope is placed in who he is. He's got this. He knows where we're going, and he's leading us there. Look at verse 28. She is so moved, verse 28, and after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Martha aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went out to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village. He was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would have not died. Martha goes back and gets Mary. She quickly responds by racing forward. And how does she greet Jesus? As one without hope. She says exactly what Martha said. Mary doesn't have the hope that Martha has. She doesn't recognize Jesus, the resurrection and the life. By the way, the mourners follow her. The mourners follow her. Have you ever seen the skits where somebody's just walking along the street and starts looking up? And all of a sudden, everybody around them starts doing what? And they don't know why they're looking up. They just saw somebody looking up. Well, think about it. The mourners are sitting there. Mary's with them. Martha says, hey, come over here. All of a sudden, she whispers in her ear. Mary goes running, and all the mourners do what? I don't know where we're going, but we're going to follow her. And they're chasing after her. They don't know where they're going. She left, we leave. We don't know where she's going. Well, let's just follow her. So now we see a new group. The mourners. The Jewish followers. In verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her were also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? The time had come. Their hearts were open. The disciples were waiting to see what Jesus was going to do. Martha was waiting to see Mary. And now even the mourners are there going, what is he going to do? He had a plan. He was doing this intentionally. He had told the disciples it was to glorify God and it was for their sake. And echoing this to Mary, I'm going to do this for your sake, that you will bring glory to God. You'll come to hope in him. And now he sees the anguish of Mary and the crowd. And what does he do? He's healed others. Why didn't he come? You know, Jesus waits for us to open our heart. Jesus waits for us to really be open to him, to break. Jesus stands at the door and knocks. He doesn't kick it in. For some of us, we may believe, but we have to fully open our heart to experience him. But look at verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been in there 4 days. By the way, the King James says, Lord, he stinketh. This was a large stone. It says in verse 41, they had to move it. But that's not Martha's first reaction. It's to wrestle with doubt. Show me where the tomb is. Roll the stone away. Lord, it's going to put out a bad odor. Don't you remember? Look what it says in verse 40. Did not I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? She's still questioning. Just move the stone. Verse 41. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. This is it. Jesus delayed his arrival to Bethany. He endangered the life of the disciples. He met Martha and Mary, and the mourners are now out with open hearts, waiting to see what's going to happen. The event is ready to occur. And he says, even this prayer is for their benefit, so that they can see that I'm relying on you, Father, to work through me. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Verse 43. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Yes, no more doubt, no more questions. By the way, a friend of mine who preaches in an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal, he said Jesus had to say, Lazarus, come out, because if he had just said, come out, the whole tomb would have emptied. Verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did what? Put their faith in him. The crowd finally believed. Now, by the way, think about something here. They knew Lazarus had died. They came to mourn alongside him. They've been there for days. There's no doubt Lazarus was dead, buried, mourning, funeral's over, days have passed, and now they see him alive. And they place their faith in Jesus. He had planned this entire thing for days. Even to the point of endangering his disciples and causing Martha and Mary to weep unconsolably. Sometimes when we prioritize reaching the lost, would we really want to see people come to faith? We have to sacrifice some things that we like for their sake. We are a witness for Christ when we step out in faith, even in impossible circumstances, and when it calls us to sacrifice. What are you willing to do to bring somebody to Jesus? Experience an awkward season in a relationship? Extend an olive branch to an unruly neighbor? Openly acknowledge your faith in a place that's not exactly conducive to it? Letting somebody have their way, even if it means giving up something you like. But that's not the whole story. Look at verse 46. But some of them, some of the Jewish mourners, went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they said. "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." And then jumping to verse 53, so from that day on they plotted to take his life. Notice they didn't deny what Jesus did. They even said he's doing all these miraculous signs, but if we believe in him, if we place our faith in him, we're going to lose out. We're going to lose our place and our position and the nation that we're over. This is the Sanhedrin. Even the Roman Empire has to work through us to govern this place. And if we follow Jesus, if we place faith in him, we're going to lose it all. Their hearts were not soft or open. They were closed, solid, and now enraged, to the point of saying Jesus was simply an acceptable loss in their plans. John recounts this story for us today. Like the believers 2,000 years ago, they heard it, they were amazed, but they were left with a challenge. If you believe like the disciples, add to it trust. If you believe like Martha and Mary, add to it hope. If you're like those believers in chapter 11 who had to understand it's about the lost, and we may have to experience some uncomfortable times to be a witness for Jesus, you could be like the Sanhedrin who said, "No, we refuse. We will not follow. We will not do this." Or you could be like those who had open hearts, the believing mourners who had come to comfort but now found comfort in Jesus. They left faithful to Christ. How will you answer Jesus' question? "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? If you need to answer that question, you can join me in Heritage in 5 after the service. You see, what happened to Lazarus is just a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in a few weeks. Jesus died to accomplish his Father's ultimate plan, to provide atonement for us, a sacrifice. one that we could not offer for ourselves. Only He could. We'll be remembering the cross, remembering the resurrection, showing His triumph over sin and death. And that's why we take communion. The bread symbolizing His body, the cup symbolizing His blood, to reflect on our relationship with God that He provided through His sacrifice and draws us together as brothers and sisters.